evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. It's just one video shot on a cell phone recently at the University of California at Riverside, but it tells you a lot about what our kids are learning at school and therefore where we may be heading as a country. In the video, a student called Edith Messias sees a man wearing a Make America Great Again hat and becomes so enraged that she steals it off his head. He demands it back, she refuses, and this exchange ensues. Watch.
You know what this represents? This represents genocide.
I understand.
Genocide of a bunch of people.
You do not get to take other people's property that is legally theirs in this country.
Man, your laws. You're recording me like I'm the criminal here.
Because you stole my property. That is literally a crime.
This land. Your ancestors stole this land.
That is
I hate this country.
That's why I say leave.
I hate it, and I'm not
That's
leaving.
why I say leave.
I'm staying here because there needs to be fixed here, so that's why I'm staying.
Okay. Then
all
you
right?
don't, but you don't fix it by
because
breaking the laws.
we need to get rid of all y'all. Freedom of speech, boy.
I don't care what you have to say.
Because your freedom of speech is literally killing a lot of people out there. That's what it is. Because you're out there wearing hats like these that promote laws and legislations that literally kill and murder in the masses people of color.
F your laws. I hate this country and I'm staying here anyway. Your ancestors stole this land. Your free speech is killing people. It used to be that only the ignorant or the insane talk that way. Yet this is a woman who completed high school and is now receiving a college education, and that's what's changed. Edith Messias talks this way precisely because she was educated in America. She learned these views in school. She and millions of other students who for the past 30 years have been taught to hate America, its laws, its customs, its history. While the rest of us are busy at work raising families, our children are learning that America itself is illegitimate and evil. To them, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights are not seminal documents protecting essential freedoms. They're scraps of paper complicit in some vaguely defined genocide. Edith Messias has learned that America is rotten, and therefore she believes she has no positive obligations to our society. She believes that people who look like the founders of this country are stained with blood guilt, and it is her right, even her duty, to hate them and to punish them for the crime of existing. She didn't come to any of this on her own. She was taught it. Millions of young people are learning the same lessons. Every time an athlete protests the national anthem or a school bans American flags on Cinco de Mayo, those lessons are reinforced. This is the future the left is creating. Once you accept that everything older than the milk in your fridge is morally reprehensible and must be destroyed, the entire past starts to look like an uninterrupted nightmare of bigotry and depression. You begin to see racism everywhere, even here.
The Grinch hated Christmas, the whole Christmas season. Now, please don't ask why. No one quite knows the reason. It could be, perhaps, that his shoes were too tight. It could be his head wasn't screwed on just right.
That's right. Dr. Seuss has been called out as a racist. A month ago, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were the designated villains. Their statues were toppled, their existences purged from popular memory. But the revolution has gathered steam since then. Now, a librarian in Massachusetts has rejected First Lady Melania Trump's gift of Dr. Seuss's books, claiming the illustrations are, quote, racist caricatures. Well, the Cat in the Hat is a wonderful cat, but leftists could not be contented with that. In modern America, everything's racist, they'll say as they search for invisible traces. A wonderful cat in a hat can't be funny. He has to be mocking black people for money. And even if Dr. Seuss had no intention to do any wrong, they'll destroy his invention. You'd think that there's no way that this could be true, but for today's leftists, the limits are few. With each day's new outrage, they simmer and stew and suck in their faces until they turn blue. LaDawn Jones is a former Democratic state representative from the state of Georgia, and she joins us now. LaDawn, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thanks for having me back, Tucker.
So I'll admit, as a middle-aged man who majored in history, not postmodern feminist poetry, this was confusing to me, and I mocked it at first. Dr. Seuss racist? He was a liberal. But then I read, as they say in graduate school, the text. And so I think I understand what's going on here. I want to read you a portion of The Cat in the Hat, and you confirm for me that this is in fact bigotry. I know some good games we could play, said the cat. I know some new tricks, said the Cat in the Hat. A lot of good tricks. I'll show them to you. Your mother will not mind at all if I do. The cat is being portrayed as shady and manipulative here. And that clearly is bigotry. I think you'd agree.
I don't know if I can agree with that. So, you know, we're going to whether or not Dr. Seuss had a history of racism in his past, and it is true. Now, will we call every Cat in the Hat, every Dr. Seuss book a picture of bigotry and racism? I think that may go a little bit too far.
Oh, I don't. Then maybe. But hold on. Wait, no, but you're reading. Okay, so I guess I have an advantage here because I have, as we say in the academy, the text right in front of me. I want to confront you with the text once more. Then Sally and I did not know what to say. Our mother was out of the house for the day. Now, if that's not a damaging stereotype of single parenthood, I don't know what is. And the idea that this kind of garbage winds up in the hands of preschoolers, I guess shouldn't surprise me given the racist nature of our country. Are you surprised?
You know, that's cute, Tucker, but the reality is, you know, that the librarian that called Dr. Seuss's works partly bigotry and racism spent the majority of her letter to the First Lady of the United States on something far more substantive. But of course, conservatives who want to accuse people who bring up racial issues as race baiting will only focus on that part of her letter.
No, but actually,
what is a serious situation?
But hold on. I don't think all bringing up racial issues is race baiting at all. I'm doing it now, and I'm not race baiting, and I think there are lots of legitimate conversations to have. I'm responding to something very specific she said, which was that Dr. Seuss is a racist. She said that. Now, this was troubling to me as someone who was weaned on Dr. Seuss, who raised 4 children on Dr. Seuss, and then I realized, and I think we have the pictures here, that it's not just my family, but famous political figures have endorsed Dr. Seuss, including the Obamas, and I think we may have actual documentary evidence of the Obamas reading Dr. Seuss. Oh, here it is. Watch.
Pretty much all the stuff you need to know is in Dr. Seuss.
Now, we're in a revolutionary moment where we're reassessing what we thought we knew, and I'm sure that you're an Obama supporter. In light of what he just said, so. Can you continue to support him?
Oh, absolutely. Because here's the reality for many African Americans and people of color in the United States. There are parts of American history, there are famous people in American history who we have to take them for their great parts and dismiss them for the parts of them that were brought up in some of the racist and biggest ways that America had in its history. And so Dr. Seuss, I actually had to, once I heard the story, pull out our Dr. Seuss books that are on my children's bookshelf and take a closer look at them so I can see exactly what it was that was the complaint. And as is normal for many of us.
What was it? I mean, actually, I've been obviously speaking tongue-in-cheek because this is, like, literally demented. But since you said that you checked Dr. Seuss for racism, what did you find? Where were the racist parts?
So you look at many of the drawings, and you have to put it in the context of the times that many of these books were written. And you can see that there are some very stereotypical drawings of Asian Americans. Dr. Seuss was known for some very stereotypical blackface drawings prior to the books that most of us are familiar with and know and have on our bookshelves.
What books are you talking about? I mean, I grew up not far from Dr. Seuss in California. Theodore Geisel, he was kind of a local hero, big liberal, as I'm sure you know, and he wrote a bunch of books against racism, including The Sneetches, great book. I'm not aware of what you're talking about. I don't think he did many books where he illustrated people. What books specifically on your bookshelf were racist?
Absolutely. No, not specific books. He was actually a cartoonist for political ads. And so if you, a simple Google search, and the first few images that will pop up of Dr. Seuss, you would see where he drew very stereotypical black-faced pictures of individuals and of people portraying stereotypical views of Asian Americans and African Americans. It's common.
So maybe you're leaving out a little context. Do you think you're leaving out some context? The Asian Americans you're talking about were the Imperial Japanese government during the Second World War, the ones who took over Asia and raped and tortured hundreds of thousands of people to death. So you think it's racist that he portrayed that government in an unflattering light? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would imagine that if I were to draw some of the Confederate soldiers in the same kind of light that he did, despite the fact that they were treasonous, people will still find many of those caricatures, if I took their worst features and put it out there and made fun of them, they will call that racist too. So yes, actually I do. It doesn't matter if they were bad people.
It's okay to, I think it was okay in 1943 to mock the Japanese army, and so maybe it's lacking a little historical context. It's not okay. It's not okay. Who put you in charge of what's okay? okay? Like, wait, let me just ask, is there any recognition, I know we're like debating on TV and everything, but just part of you think like, wow, the people I'm around, maybe even myself, we're scolds. We've like turned into something we used to hate when we were kids, which is people who jump up and say, you can't do that. I mean, do you ever think that? Like, what have I become? Well, that I'm denouncing Dr. Seuss?
Well, no. I'm going to tell you what is the first thing that normally comes to my mind is respecting the person who is near me, respecting the people who are around me. I may have private opinions, but there's certain things that you don't say out loud. There's certain things that you stop yourself from thinking out of simple human respect for common man. For example, a perfect one is when your president calls an entire league SOBs. Those are things that you just don't say out of your mouth, particularly when you are a person of power. And so although you may accepted in your community to just say, oh, we talk about people of other races as if it's not a problem. I think a good human American to make America great again knows that we respect our neighbors.
I love the parenthetical charge of racism. In your community, you might do that. No, actually, he's denouncing professional athletes of a bunch of different colors. So slow down, LaDawn. But you're dodging my key question, which is, why in the world is the left discrediting itself by going after, of all people, Dr. Seuss? Like, it's absurd. Do you recognize that at all? I think there's racism that exists. I mean, of course there is. But Dr. Seuss was not a major purveyor of it. So, like, why are you hassling Dr. Seuss? That's kind of the question. Do you feel silly when you do that?
Absolutely not. And let me tell you what's absurd. This librarian who brought up this whole Dr. Seuss issue had a whole 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs before she talked about Dr. Seuss that talked about how ridiculous it was that they used taxpayer dollars to send books to overprivileged schools that didn't need them. But instead of focusing on that very important point that you should agree with since you're a fiscal conservative, you want to focus on the latter part of her letter that talks about Dr. Seuss. You know why? Because you want to trivialize
librarians
what really
who turn
could
down
be an
books.
important issue.
I mean, she sounds like the silliest person maybe who's ever lived in this country. Okay.
Isn't it ridiculous that the First Lady of the United States wouldn't know that a school already had all of the most common
I can't believe she sent Dr. Seuss books to a library. She should be in jail. I mean, listen to yourself, LaDawn. You're a nice person. I don't mean to be mean, but come on now. Thanks for joining us today.
It's not mean. It's just not realistic. And unfortunately, we need people like you to speak up and say that, you know what?
Stop sending Dr. Seuss books. It's bigoted. Yeah, okay, good. I can't wait for this year to be over. Mark Stein has written quite a few books of his own, though the Obamas didn't like them quite as much as they liked Dr. Seuss. Maybe they need to reassess. He joins us tonight. What do you make of Seussgate, Mark?
Yeah, I think when you said it's trashing anything older than the milk in your fridge, that's right, Tucker. This is like year zero in Cambodia. The world has to be created anew. So in the space of about 20 minutes, we've gone from the Confederate flag is racist to the Star-Spangled Banner is racist. We've gone from General Lee is racist to Dr. Seuss is racist. We've gone from way down on the levee in old Alabama is minstrelsy to the cat in the hat is minstrelsy, which is actually this librarian's argument. I looked up the piece she referenced in the Journal of Social Justice Librarians or whatever it is, and it is incredibly moronic. It is part of the dumbing down of American society. The piece argues that the cat in the hat's bow tie is meant to be an evocation of 19th century racist minstrel shows. Now, just off the top of my head, cartoon characters who wear bow ties, Porky Pig, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Huckleberry Hound. Yogi Bear doesn't wear a bow. He wears a necktie like me, but his boy sidekick Boo Boo the Bear wears a bow tie. Ambrosio, I think the name is, in My Little Pony wears a bow tie. I'm not one of the many men in the Western world who are obsessed with My Little Pony and have My Little Pony parties, but I happen to know this one character in My Little Pony wears a bow tie. Cartoon characters wear bow ties. That's nothing to do with minstrel shows. We are making ourselves a society too stupid to survive, as that California student demonstrates, if we go down this path.
What's so striking to me is, so we're debating the tax bill in Washington right now, and the entire conservative establishment is kind of on board, and they're very spun up about it, and that's fine, and they're right about most of it. I think I'm not mad about it. But this is what they spend all their time doing here in D.C. All these nonprofits are focused on the tax code, which you can change instantly with a vote. Meanwhile, the culture has become so rotted that I'm wondering if we can hold together as a country. Maybe they should have paid a little more attention to stuff like this and a little less to capital gains taxes over the past 40 years. Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I would say the education system is the biggest structural defect in the United States and most other Western countries. I get these emails, or every time you do a story on the latest bit of campus craziness, I get these emails from people saying, oh, whatever happened to common sense? Well, common sense presupposes that a society has something in common. And if one person looks at a cat in a hat and thinks, oh, there's a cute cat in a funny candy-striped hat, and the other sees a 19th century minstrel show, then in fact they do not have enough in common to hold together. And that's what's really crazy about this. And just to go back to what you were talking about earlier, the problem here is that if everything is racist, nothing is racist.
Well, that's right.
So that if the Confederate flag is racist, if Robert E. Lee is racist, if and then we go to the national anthem is racist, the flag is racist, now Dr. Seuss is racist, then nothing is not racist. And we're actually nuttier than the Nazis on this. I mean, Hitler's favorite operetta was The Merry Widow, which at the time was also the biggest hit on Broadway. And nobody in the height of insanity after the Nazi period in Germany thought to examine The Merry Widow as a sort of covert Nazi thing. It just happened to be a piece of music Hitler liked. We're actually getting nuttier in our cultural totalitarianism.
Your point that common sense presupposes a common understanding of the world is really deep. I'm going to be thinking about it all night. Mark, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Tucker. Loved your poem, by the way, although I think some of your tetrameters were a bit dodgy.
That's for sure. Thanks. We've got a Fox News alert. Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price has resigned. He left earlier today following revelations that he spent more than $1 million in taxpayer money chartering private planes when he easily could have flown commercial. Well, the scandal offended the president, who repeatedly told reporters this week he was considering firing Price. With Price's departure, Don J. Wright will take over as the acting secretary over at HHS. Now, Price has been on this show a number of times. He always seemed like a decent, level-headed guy, not at all the kind of person who'd confuse a cabinet appointment with being Beyonce. But power does that to people. In Washington, it does it to an awful lot of them. Let's hope the Price affair sets a new standard here. If you're using your job, your federal job, to live more luxuriously than the people you represent, you ought to leave. Well, it's an article of faith in D.C. that Russia sabotaged last year's election. So why does every specific piece of evidence wind up being debunked? Up next, we'll ask a reporter for The Federalist if Russian collusion is based, in the end, on religious faith rather than real evidence. And then a Satanist group has a plan to force Christian bakers to bake cakes for Satan, because it is, of course, 2017 and things like that happen. We'll talk to the group's founder just ahead. Well, no story in the past year has consumed nearly as many words and as much airtime as the alleged collusion between the Donald Trump presidential campaign and the government of Russia. Hillary Clinton even suggested the collusion may compel a rerun of the 2016 election, which, of course, all of us are looking forward to. But is the core story that undergirds all of this actually real? Last week, several major outlets reported that Russia had attempted to hack election systems in 21 U.S. states. That story whipped people into a frenzy, and it turned out to be false. Journalist Glenn Greenwald, who was not a conservative, recently wrote that, quote, the Russia story of 2017, not unlike the Iraq discourse of 2002, is now driven by religious-like faith rather than rational faculties. John Daniel Davidson does not have much in common with Glenn Greenwald, but he may agree on this. He writes for The Federalist, and he joins us tonight. John, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So these words carry, and we've had Glenn on this show a number of times, but they carry particular weight because he's not pro-Trump in the slightest. He's a figure of the left, and I don't think he has any political agenda either way, but he's a logical person, a rational person, and he looks at the evidence and finds it wanting.
Yeah, I find it kind of awkward to be in a position where I'm agreeing with Glenn Greenwald on anything, but he's right about this. Ever since this Russia collusion story first came up, the media has bent over backwards going after every anonymous leak, every salacious story they could get their hands on to try to prove that the real reason Trump won the election was because he was colluding with Vladimir Putin. Democrats and their courtesans in the media cannot accept the fact that Donald Trump won a free and fair election, and there's got to be some other explanation for it, and they've latched onto this Russia story, and every time they trot out a new theory or a new leak or a new explosive document or piece of intelligence, it crumbles right away, and we've seen this throughout the past year, time after time, and this is just the latest version.
But so, I mean, it's a significant statement to say maybe the whole thing is false. I think I'm approaching that conclusion because I don't see evidence otherwise. But if it really is a lie at its core, I mean, man, we've spent an awful lot of time on this as a country.
Well, I think we need to distinguish between the claim that the Trump campaign and Trump colluded with Russia to hack the election and falsify ballots. That's the outrageous claim that a lot of Democrats would like to be true, and a lot of the mainstream media would like to be true. But to say that Russia did have propaganda that was designed not to elect one candidate over another, but to sow discord, to discredit the democratic process, to turn Americans against one another, I think there is something to that claim, and a lot of us in the conservative media were writing about this last summer, and we didn't have access to any special intelligence reports or any secret dossiers. All you had to do was pay close attention to the trolls on Twitter and Facebook, and you could tell something odd was going on with tweets and with social media memes going viral, that they were coming from, you know, what were probably Russian troll farms.
Do you think
but that shouldn't surprise anybody.
I mean, do you think that, I mean, I'm just thinking, having spent, you know, my whole life in this city, I think of all the foreign governments, Turkey is a huge one, the Saudis, there are many others, that actively pump their propaganda into our system and try to affect our political process. Do you think we're now going to have a new standard where all of that is unacceptable? I hope so.
Well, maybe we should, and that's a conversation that we could have, right? But that's not the conversation the Democrats want to have.
No.
There is a whole swath of the left that can only believe that Donald Trump either got elected because half the country are racist, or Trump colluded with Russia. But it's impossible for them to imagine that maybe Hillary Clinton was a horrible candidate who ran a horrible campaign, and vast numbers of Americans wanted something different. That can't be true. So
no, it can't.
It's got to be Russia, right?
So I'm kind of excited for this new tomorrow we're getting, where no foreign governments are allowed to influence our process. I'm in favor of that. We're going to hold them to that new standard. John, thank you.
That's right. Thank you.
Well, a group of Satanists is urging its followers to target Christian bakers and force them to bake cakes for Satan. Doesn't sound like it could be real, but again, it's 2017, so you know it is. We'll talk to the Satanic Temple's co-founder about this plot next. Well, a teacher in Florida plans to celebrate the coming holiday season in an unusual way by asking his students to hail Satan, literally. Teacher Preston Smith in Boca Raton, Florida, says he wants to put up a 300-pound pentagram in the public square down there bearing the slogan, "May the children hail Satan." The display is intended to compete with a nativity scene put up each Christmas. Meanwhile, the Satanic Temple, that's based in Salem, Mass., is encouraging its followers to find Christian bakers and ask them to bake cakes honoring the Prince of Darkness as a show of support for gay couples who've been denied cakes for weddings. Lucian Graves is the co-founder of the Satanic Temple in Massachusetts, and he joins us tonight. Lucian Graves, thank you for coming on tonight.
Thank you.
I'm of mixed views on this. I mean, part of me wants to take it seriously because there are real legal questions here, but then part of me wants to tell the truth, which is you're just a troll. and working out your unhappy childhood.
You're going to have to define for me what you think a credible religion is at this point, and then maybe you should thank organizations like Liberty Counsel or the Alliance Defending Freedom when they put forward legal cases claiming that they're taking a religious point of view, and the Supreme Court just taking those at face value. The fact of the matter is we do have affirmative values. These are an expression of our deeply held beliefs, and I think that's all anybody really needs.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation before, and right, yeah, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, in the end, this is about getting publicity and hassling people. If you really have sincere beliefs and you're
publicity
worshiping,
to what end? It's publicity towards issues we truly do.
I honestly think, not to play shrink, but it has to do with what was clearly an unhappy childhood that you had. But I guess my question is, if you have these sincere beliefs, if this is a real religion, then why not practice it? Why waste all this time bothering other people who are minding their own business?
Are you saying why don't we practice it in private and in our own churches and in our own homes? Because then I would say I'm completely on board with you, and that's exactly pretty much the message we're putting out. You don't see us going into public forums where there isn't already religious representation. What we're doing is we're upholding pluralism. And even in the case with the case...
No, you're not upholding pluralism. You're going and you're seeking out people to bother, and you're
not seeking out
small
people to bother. We're not the ones
maybe I'm
opening up.
misreading this.
No,
maybe I'm misreading
we're
this
not
story.
the ones opening up the forum. Do you ever have an evangelical on and ask them why they need to force their Bibles into schools, why they need to put up a cross on public property when they have churches all over the place? I mean, when you open up that public forum, you have to be prepared for
what they're not doing is
viewpoints.
what they're not doing is showing up at your house and saying, say the Lord's Prayer with me, Lucian Graves, and if you don't, then I'm going to sue you, or I'm going to get the government to launch a suit against you. You say you and your followers, to the extent you have any, are seeking out small businesses that don't want to accommodate you in order to force them to violate their own beliefs. That's my understanding.
It highlights a disparity. The fact is that religion is a protected class, sexual orientation is not. If you want to be able to deny people service, fine. Let's be consistent. The gay hairdresser shouldn't have to dress the hair of the evangelical theocrat who wouldn't serve him a cake. Then we're on an equal level. Then that's okay.
I'm fine with that. I mean, I think if it's your business and you're being asked to violate your beliefs, I think, and they're sincere beliefs.
This does bring up some troubling questions, though, about protected classes and race.
It does bring up. It does actually. Yes, it does. But one of the reasons that this was not an issue after the civil rights movement. I mean, no one's denying people service on the basis of their race, which is clearly immoral and wrong and illegal, and it should be. But questions like the bakery out in Colorado, one of the reasons those haven't arisen in the last 50 years is because people had a sense of decency and politeness, and they didn't feel that it was the right thing to get in someone else's face and force them for the sake of making some kind of public statement to violate their beliefs. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, they didn't behave like you.
Sure, then we should. Then the gay baker shouldn't be forced to make a cake for the evangelical theocrat. And then I'm fine with that.
I kind of agree. I actually kind of agree with that. But here's the difference. I haven't seen a single case of an evangelical forcing any kind of bakery to bake a cake that violates the baker's personal beliefs. And if there was such a case, I would come down on the side of the bakery, because why don't you back off and let people live their lives? In fact, why don't you do that, Lucian Graves?
Right, exactly,
if indeed that's your real name.
Because religion is a protected class. So
whatever.
Either take
you're
away
making
the
a nonsensical point, and I think you should crawl back into your hole. Thanks for joining us tonight. I appreciate it. Insider trading is illegal. Don't try it. You'll go to jail. Ha! Unless you work for the Congress. They do it a lot, and they get away with it. We're talking to Peter Schweitzer next. He wrote a whole book about this. The practice is widespread. It's appalling, and we've got details. Then we'll talk to a civil rights commissioner who says the left's rhetoric on crime is needlessly inflaming tensions in this country and is hurting America. Peter Cushing. HHS Secretary Tom Price's use of government planes, over $1 million worth, got plenty of well-deserved attention. But it may not be the most glaring example of government corruption this week. According to a remarkable new report from Politico, congressional aides routinely engage in insider trading, buying and selling stock in companies their committees have the ability to regulate and investigate, and timing those investments around the legislation, which is unbelievable. It's obviously an illegal conflict of interest in the executive branch. If you or I tried it, we'd be in jail, but for some reason they get away with it. Why is that? Peter Schweitzer knows a lot about this subject. He's written about it for years. He's the president of the Government Accountability Institute. He wrote the book Clinton Cash. And he's written on this exact thing before, and that's, Peter, you were the first person I thought of when I read this piece, and I thought, Peter Schweitzer kind of showed this to the world 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and I thought it got shut down after your book, but no, why?
Yeah, a lot of us thought it was going to get shot down. When my book came out in 2011, they passed something called the Stock Act, which was supposed to regulate this activity, but it hasn't. They've gutted the bill. And so essentially you have a system, Tucker, where the only place in America, there's this island in Washington, D.C., that allows people to trade stocks where they have a vested outcome or influence on the outcome. If you're a judge, you can't trade stock on cases you're dealing with. If you're a reporter, a journalist covering Wall Street, you can't trade stock in those areas. The only place you can do this in Congress, and it's a massive problem. And it's not only, by the way, a problem, Tucker, of them trading their own stock. They can share this information or even sell this information to outside investors, and they can make bank on it as well.
I just don't understand why the Justice Department doesn't come down. I mean, that is so transparently corrupt. That subverts the whole idea of government. And again, if you tried that or I tried it, we would be perp-walked in handcuffs in front of the cameras.
Yeah, if you go back and, remember Tammany Hall, and the phrase that they used was legal graft. They did things that were graft, but they were technically legal. And in this particular case, it's very hard to prove a legal case of insider trading. The other problem is, look, who makes the rules? Congress makes the rules, and they have decided to exempt themselves largely from the insider trading rules. That applies to them, it applies to their spouses, and it applies to their staff. So, as the Politico report pointed out, Tucker, you've got hundreds of congressional staffers, and those are only the ones that are required to disclose their stock trades. You have hundreds of them trading stock every year in companies that they regulate. These could be companies that are subject to congressional action. These could be companies that are going to benefit from certain legislation. These are companies that could be hurt by certain pieces of legislation. And as you know, Tucker, oftentimes congressional staffers know even more about these details than members of Congress do, so they can really clean up in this area.
It just makes a mockery of our markets. I mean, the whole point of the markets in the United States is they're transparent, and all of us have roughly the same information. But if the people making the rules are profiting from those rules, how can this be changed? This is so offensive. How can people like this go to prison where they deserve to be?
Well, number one, they should just simply ban, if you are a congressional staffer or a member of Congress, ban the trading of individual stocks. Or number two, at least require a blind trust, which is not perfect. But that's the only way this is going to work. You've got to have a clear, bright line that says this activity is illegal. The problem is, on Capitol Hill, they're assuming that they're going to be able to get away with it because people aren't paying attention. It's one of those drain the swamp issues that's persistent and has got to be tackled directly.
It really does. Somebody needs to overturn the tables in the temple, like tonight.
Yeah.
Peter Schweitzer, thank you for that. You've done so much great stuff on this subject. Thanks. Last night we had a guest called Monique Presley on to discuss the increased racialization, if that's a word, should be, of American politics. Civil Rights Commissioner Peter Kirsanow watched. He was infuriated by the claims Presley made. He'll be here in a minute to explain why he was. Stay tuned. Well, during last night's show, we interviewed a lawyer called Monique Presley. She came on to discuss the repeated injection of racial rhetoric into the national anthem protests and, by extension, into the American political discourse. Here's part of what she said.
The issue is why there are protests in the first place, and the people who are living terrified every day just walking down the street. So if you look at how we got here because African American men are disproportionately stopped, disproportionately searched, disproportionately arrested, and disproportionately killed per capita in this country.
Peter Kirsanow is an attorney. He's a member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He's a regular guest on this show. He saw that segment last night. He objected to it, so we asked him to come on and explain why he did. Peter Kirsanow joins us tonight. Peter, thanks for coming on.
Absolutely.
So what was your contention with that segment last night?
Almost everything that you just played was false, inaccurate, and based on a false premise. And it's a false premise that's been perpetuated for quite some time now. There's no doubt whatsoever that this country has a baleful history with respect to race. Blacks have been discriminated against in egregious ways. People have been killed, and it's something that's been relatively recent. And there's no doubt that blacks have been targeted by cops. In a nation of 320 million people, there are going to be racists, and some of those are going to be cops. But for the last 30 years, that premise that blacks are disproportionately targeted, arrested, shot by cops is completely false, and all you have to do is look at the Department of Justice statistics. And we've looked at these kinds of things in the Civil Rights Commission. There are copious studies on this. Just for example, and this is pretty bad, frankly, the Justice Department stats show that blacks are in fact killed 2.5 times more often than whites are by policemen. However, when you take a look at, remember that statistic, 2.5 times more frequently, but that's far less than what the data would predict given black crime rates. Take New York City, for example. Blacks are not 2.5 times more likely to commit crimes. Blacks in New York City are 35 times more likely to commit robberies than whites, 38 times more likely to commit murders, and 51 times more likely to engage in shootings, regardless of whether or not it results in a homicide. So when you think about 2.5 times versus 51 times, the type of police involvement that you would expect from those kinds of stats is far below than what would be predicted. And that has consequences in regard to what's known as the Ferguson effect. What we saw is, and Heather McDonald, the great scholar from Manhattan Institute, has done a number of studies on this, great work on this, testified before the Civil Rights Commission showing that because of these protests and the consequences of it, police withdraw from active and proactive policing, and sometimes the city administrations tell them to, as we saw with the mayor of Baltimore. The Obama administration had consent decrees which changed police practices, so police withdrew from active policing. That consequence is profound because despite the fact that we've had decades of a decline in the crime rate, right after Ferguson we saw a significant spike in violent crimes, most especially in those cities which witnessed the types of high-profile shootings and protests that resulted in police drawing back. Except for, this is very interesting, Pew studies showed that 72% of police were less engaged in proactive policing as a result of this Ferguson effect, except for one cohort, black cops. Black cops are 3.3 times more likely to shoot black suspects than white cops. But even so, when you look at the correlative crime data, that is black involvement in crime versus police shootings, the number of shootings are far below that which would be predicted based on crime involvement. And when you have the false narrative and you've got this perpetuation of all these protests and it causes the Ferguson effect, here's what the consequences are. Take a look at the data. Despite the dramatic decline in crime rates, in 2015, 900 more blacks were murdered than in the year before. In 2016, 900 more. So we had 7,881 blacks killed in 2016, the vast majority, more than 90%, by other blacks, not cops. That's nearly twice as many as the number of soldiers that were killed in the entire Iraq War, and it's at least partially a consequence of this false narrative feeding this outrage, which then feeds the protests, which then results in a Ferguson effect, and then the spike of the crime rates. Most of the people, I think, in goodwill may be ignorant of those facts and believe, subjectively, I've been pulled over by the cops, and if you talk within your own little universe, you believe that maybe you're being subjected or treated differently, except when you look at the objective facts. Most people in good faith probably believe, but are ignorant of the fact that, in fact, the narrative is false. But there is a cohort of individuals, some politicians, some political opportunists that are using this for a political imperative that's despicable because we have bodies on the ground.
I don't think I've ever done a segment where I didn't say one word because I was so mesmerized by what you were saying. I can't remember someone with that kind of command of the numbers. Thank you. Peter Kirsnow, I'm really glad that you came on tonight.
Thanks, Tucker.
I hope you will come back anytime. Thank you. Well, there is actually a scandal tonight in Washington. It does not involve Russia. Maybe that's why no one wants to talk about it. Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, he's in trouble. We'll tell you what for. Stay tuned. An update tonight on the trial of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. Menendez has spent most of this month on trial. He faces 18 counts of fraud and bribery. Prosecutors say he accepted hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts, vacations, campaign donations from a Florida doctor called Solomon Melhen. In return, the senator allegedly protected Melhen from federal investigators, allowing him to commit more than $100 million in Medicare fraud. Menendez, of course, deserves a presumption of innocence, and we give that to him. But the case has enough evidence to go on trial, and it hasn't received 1/100th the coverage given to Russia. Weird. Another thing, 7 years ago, I edited the first story accusing Menendez of wrongdoing. At the time, he said I was a racist. Keep that in mind the next time you hear someone use that line. That's it for us tonight. Here's Sean Hannity. Have a great weekend.